I think it's time to trace the emergence of gender in Australian life and acknowledge the role our first female Prime Minister played in enabling gender to be used to override the importance of sex in Australian society. Because I want it to be clear that our first female Prime Minister is responsible for the newfound vigour of sexism and misogyny in this country. And that is why I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by that woman. I will not. The women of Australia will not be lectured about misogyny by that woman. Not now and never again. I hope the former Prime Minister of Australia has got a piece of paper and is writing out her apology to the women of Australia. Because if she wants to know what misogyny looks like in modern Australia, she doesn't need to make a speech. She just needs to read the amendments her government made to the Sex Discrimination Act in 2013. That's what she needs to do. Let's go through the former Prime Minister's repulsive double standards when it comes to misogyny and sexism. We're now supposed to take seriously the former Prime Minister's position as the chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, when this is the former Prime Minister who oversaw the insertion of gender identity into Australia's Sex Discrimination Act. Gender is described in that Act as the gender-related identity, appearance or mannerisms or other gender-related characteristics of a person, whether by way of medical intervention or not, with or without regard to the person's designated sex at birth. This is the former Prime Minister of Australia whose government prioritised that ill-defined concept of gender discrimination over the concise reality of sex discrimination in the Sex Discrimination Act. This is the former Prime Minister who made it possible for an ex-military person, must be careful, to assume the identity, appearance and mannerisms of a woman and pursue anti-discrimination complaints against 4 Australians for the new crime of misgendering. An Australian woman was forced to pay that ex-military person thousands of dollars after an online exchange in which the Australian woman liked several comments that referred to the ex-military person as male. This is the former Australian Prime Minister who made it possible for a person who assumes the identity, appearance and mannerisms of a woman to take legal action against an Australian woman for not allowing that person to join a woman-only social media platform. That action is currently ongoing and the platform is not presently operating. So right now, there is no Australian social media platform for women that can exclude people who have assumed the identity, appearance and mannerisms of a woman. This is the former Australian Prime Minister who made it possible for an Australian woman to be investigated by the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commissioner for saying that men who assume the identity, appearance and mannerisms of women remain biological men. This is the former Australian Prime Minister who paved the way for women who tweeted, "Men cannot breastfeed," to be censored and subject to investigation by the Australian government for doing so. This is the former Australian Prime Minister who enabled a person to assume the identity, appearance and mannerisms of a woman and switch from the men's national handball team to the women's national handball team to compete in an international championship. The name of the woman that person displaced has been lost to history, but that person's career in women's sport did not end there. There are too many instances of legal actions taken against Australian women courtesy of the amendment to the Sex Discrimination Act made by Julia Gillard's government to list. And that list is growing. This is the woman from whom we're supposed to take lectures about sexism. And then of course it goes on. I was offended personally when the former Prime Minister of Australia said, and I quote, "I was not going to stand before the nation as Prime Minister and cry for myself. I was not going to let anyone conclude that a woman could not take it." I was also very offended on behalf of the women of Australia when in her position as the chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, the former Prime Minister of Australia said, "Women, I think, need to mobilise. Women in powerful and decision-making positions need to use their power for change. Consider the changes that powerful woman made and how difficult she has made it for Australian women to mobilise. Julia Gillard has moved on. She won't suffer the consequences of the changes she has wrought on Australian women. She has left Australian women behind to suffer the consequences of the changes her government made. If the former Prime Minister of Australia wants to be taken seriously, if she wants to demonstrate that she's woken up after the changes her government made to the Sex Discrimination Act and regrets the consequences that have been suffered by Australian women, and she's gone, oh dear, there's this thing that's happening where men are abusing the changes my government made to that act. Oh my lords, Australian women are disempowered and our sex has been displaced by men who have assumed the identity, appearance and mannerisms of women. She must address the changes the government she led made to the Sex Discrimination Act and acknowledge the devastating effect those changes have had on all Australian women. The former Australian Prime Minister is no ally of Australian women, and she should think seriously about her role in the ongoing persecution of Australian women by use of the amendments her government made to the Sex Discrimination Act. The changes the former Prime Minister of Australia made to the Sex Discrimination Act have been used as a battering ram against the rights of Australian women. Julia Gillard must think seriously about how she has affected the role of women in public life and renounce her actions in allowing those changes to be enacted. Over to you, Julia. What you gonna do?